Hypatia, the light they couldn't turn off. There are some people in history who are remembered not because they conquered the world, but because the world could not tolerate what they represented. Hypatia of Alexandria was one of them. She was not a queen, not a warrior, not a prophet. She led no army, raised no rebellion, and claimed no throne. She was a philosopher, a mathematician, a teacher, and in one of the most dangerous cities of the ancient world. That made her powerful enough to be feared. To understand Hypatia, you have to understand Alexandria. In the late 4th and early 5th centuries, Alexandria was one of the great cities of the Mediterranean. Brilliant, wealthy, cultured, and deeply unstable. It was a city where ideas mattered. A city of scholars, merchants, priests, officials, and mobs. Greek philosophy still lived there. Roman power still ruled there. Christianity was rising there with unstoppable force. Old traditions had not fully disappeared. New certainties had not fully settled. And beneath the grandeur of the city, tension was always waiting. This was the world Hypatia entered. She was born into intellect. Her father, Theon of Alexandria, was a respected mathematician and scholar. Under his guidance, Hypatia received an education of extraordinary rigor. She studied mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, rhetoric, and logic, disciplines that demanded not only intelligence, but discipline, memory, and precision. In a world where public intellectual authority was overwhelmingly male, Hypatia did something rare. She did not remain hidden. She did not remain secondary. She stepped into public life as a mind to be reckoned with, and people noticed. As she grew older, Hypatia became one of Alexandria's most admired teachers. She taught in the Platonic philosophical tradition and became the city's leading Neoplatonic thinker. Students came from beyond Egypt to hear her speak. Some would go on to hold positions of wealth, power, and influence. To them, Hypatia was not merely well-educated. She was a master of her discipline, a woman whose intellect commanded respect in rooms where women were seldom expected to lead. She taught philosophy, but also mathematics and astronomy. This mattered. Hypatia was not only discussing virtue or metaphysics. She was working in fields that sought order in the cosmos itself. Number, motion, proportion, structure. Her life stood at the meeting point of reason and wonder, and that gave her a kind of authority unlike any official title. She held no office. She passed no laws. She spoke for no army and no church. Yet she possessed something rulers have always understood instinctively: influence without force. Her students admired her. Civic elites respected her. Even powerful officials sought her counsel. Among them was Orestes, the Roman prefect of Alexandria, who is known to have valued her judgment. In a city constantly balancing on the edge of unrest, Hypatia became a figure whose credibility reached across social and political lines. That kind of respect is rare, and in turbulent times, it can also be dangerous, because Alexandria was changing. By Hypatia's lifetime, the Roman Empire was no longer the world of the old pagan order. Christianity, once persecuted, had become one of the most powerful forces in imperial life. In Alexandria, religious conflict intensified alongside political rivalry. Communities distrusted one another. The struggle was no longer only about belief. It was about power, legitimacy, and who would define the future of the city. At the center of this tension stood two men: Orestes, the imperial governor, and Cyril, the bishop of Alexandria. Their conflict was bitter, public, and deeply consequential. It was a struggle over authority itself. Who would command loyalty? Whose vision of order would prevail? And whether civic power or ecclesiastical power would dominate the city's life. Hypatia was not the author of that conflict. But she stood too close to it to remain untouched, because she was respected by Orestes, because she remained a visible symbol of intellectual independence, because she represented an older scholarly tradition that answered neither to mob nor bishop. She became vulnerable. Soon, rumor did what rumor always does in frightened societies. It simplified, it distorted, it weaponized. Stories spread that Hypatia was the obstacle to reconciliation between Orestes and Cyril. Her learning, once admired, could now be recast as something suspicious. Her philosophical background could be turned into a mark against her. Independence itself could be read as hostility. And once a society decides that a thinker is not merely inconvenient, but dangerous, violence is never far behind. In the year 415, that violence arrived. One day, as Hypatia traveled through Alexandria in her chariot, she was intercepted by a mob of Christian zealots. They dragged her from the vehicle and took her to a church. What followed was murder, brutal, public, unforgivable. Ancient sources describe the killing with horror. Hypatia was stripped, attacked, and torn apart by the mob. Her remains were carried away and burned. It was not simply an act of rage, it was an act of erasure. She was not killed in battle, not executed after a trial, not overthrown from a throne. She was destroyed as a scholar, as a teacher, as a symbol. And that is why her death has echoed so far beyond her own century. Not because she single-handedly ended classical civilization. History is never that simple. Learning did not vanish in a day. Philosophy did not die with one woman, however extraordinary she was. But her murder came to represent something enduring. The moment when intellect, independence, and public respect were no protection at all against fanaticism and political hatred. Hypatia's life was a rebuke to every system that demands blind allegiance. She belonged fully to no faction. She was useful to no dogma. She could not easily be absorbed, controlled, or made obedient. And that may be why she became intolerable. There is something deeply threatening about a person who refuses to surrender truth to tribe. A person who stands in public, speaks with authority, and owes that authority not to violence, inheritance, or divine claim, but to knowledge. Hypatia's rebellion was not loud. She did not call for revolution. She did not denounce the empire. She did not try to seize power for herself. Her rebellion was quieter than that. She insisted that the life of the mind mattered. She lived as though truth was worth pursuing for its own sake. She stood for reason in a world increasingly organized around faction, pressure, and control. And history remembers people like that. Not always in their own lifetime, not always fairly, but eventually. Hypatia left very little in her own voice. Most of what survives about her comes through students, chroniclers, and later generations who saw in her story something larger than a single biography. That is why she has endured in so many forms. As a martyr for philosophy, as a victim of fanaticism, as a symbol of intellectual freedom, and as one of history's most haunting examples of a woman whose brilliance made her impossible to ignore, and impossible, in the end, to control. Her story still matters because the pattern never truly disappears. There are always ages that grow suspicious of nuance, always movements that prefer certainty to inquiry, always factions that call independent thought a threat, always people who mistake obedience for truth. Hypatia reminds us that civilization is built not only by soldiers, rulers, and laws. It is also built by teachers, by thinkers, by those who ask difficult questions when easier lies are available, by those who refused to surrender reason to fear. The mob that murdered her ended a life, but it could not destroy what that life had come to mean, because real intellectual courage does not always announce itself with banners and battle cries. Sometimes it appears in a lecture hall, in disciplined speech, in patient teaching, in the calm refusal to let power dictate what may be thought. That was Hypatia's strength, and that was her danger. She showed that a mind can become a form of resistance, that dignity can exist without office, that truth can stand apart from faction, and that those who carry light into darkening times are often the first to be targeted. Today, Hypatia endures, not because of the cruelty that killed her, but because of the clarity with which she lived. The empire around her is gone. The factions that consumed her have turned to dust. The streets of Alexandria have changed beyond recognition, but her story remains. And it remains because every generation eventually faces the same question. What happens when a society begins to fear its thinkers more than its tyrants? Hypatia answered that question with her life. She stood for learning in an age of unrest, for inquiry in an age of certainty, for intellectual independence in a world demanding allegiance. And though they silenced her voice, they could not silence what she represented. Because as long as her story is told, the light that shone through her has never truly gone out. It still burns, steady, defiant, unconquered. The light they could not control.